The day Elena Cross walked into Henderson's general store, she didn't know she was about to be destroyed in front of the entire town. But what happened next? When a mysterious rancher stepped from the shadows and spoke 6 words that silenced every cruel laugh, would change everything. This is a story about a woman the world decided wasn't worth seeing, and the man who proved them all wrong. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after it ends. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Coldwater Springs, a frontier town that seemed to exist solely on judgment and gossip. The year was 1882, and in a place where survival meant everything, appearance meant even more. Elena Cross stood outside Henderson's general store, her hand trembling on the worn wooden door handle. At 23 years old, she had learned to steel herself against the stares, the whispers, the barely concealed disgust that followed her wherever she went. But knowledge didn't make it easier. It never did. She smoothed down the front of her patched calico dress, the only presentable one she owned, and felt the familiar tightness across her chest and hips. The dress had fit better 2 years ago, before grief and hardship had changed her body in ways the town found unforgivable. In Coldwater Springs, a woman's worth was measured in inches around her waist, and by those standards, Elena had been found wanting her entire life. "Just get the supplies and leave," she whispered to herself, the same mantra she repeated every time she had to venture into town. "Don't look at them, don't listen, just survive." The bell above the door chimed as she pushed it open, and the effect was immediate. Conversations died mid-sentence, heads turned, and then, like a wave gathering strength, the whispers began. "Lord have mercy, would you look at that? Someone ought to tell her that dress is 2 sizes too small. Probably burst right out of it if she bends over." Elena kept her eyes fixed firmly on the counter at the back of the store, where old Mr. Henderson stood polishing a glass jar with studied indifference. He'd take her money, he always did, but he wouldn't defend her. Nobody ever did. The store was more crowded than usual. Saturday afternoon meant ranchers came in from the surrounding territories, cowboys fresh from the trail, and society ladies who had nothing better to do than sharpen their tongues on anyone vulnerable enough to be a target. Mrs. Patricia Thornberry stood near the fabric display, her pinched face twisted in poorly concealed disdain. Next to her, her daughter Melissa, 17, blonde, and blessed with the kind of figure that made men tip their hats and women seethe with envy, giggled behind her gloved hand. "I didn't know they made fabric in those quantities," Melissa said, loud enough to carry across the entire store. "Must have taken a whole bolt just for that one dress." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Elena felt heat crawl up her neck, but she forced herself to keep walking, one foot in front of the other, eyes forward, breathe. "Now, Melissa, that's uncharitable," Mrs. Thornberry said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm sure Miss Cross is doing the best she can with what the Lord gave her, though why he chose to give her quite so much is a mystery we may never solve." More laughter, sharper this time. Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. The pain helped. It gave her something to focus on besides the burning shame that threatened to consume her. "Maybe she's eating for 2, someone else chimed in. Tom Bradley, a ranch hand who spent more time drinking than working. "Though I can't imagine who'd want to." "That's enough," Mr. Henderson finally spoke, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is a place of business, not a circus." "Could have fooled me," Tom muttered, setting off another round of Snickers. Elena reached the counter and pulled out the carefully folded list her father had written in his shaking hand that morning. James Cross was dying. Consumption, the doctor said, though they couldn't afford the medicine that might have slowed it down. Every penny went to keeping their small orchard alive, the only inheritance her father had to leave her, the only thing standing between Elena and complete destitution. "Mr. Henderson," she said quietly, sliding the list across the wooden counter, "I need these supplies, please." The shopkeeper took the list without meeting her eyes, his weathered face carefully neutral. "This'll come to about $8, Miss Cross. You got that?" "Yes, sir." She'd been saving for weeks, skipping meals, wearing the same dress day after day despite the way it strained at the seams. $8 was a fortune, but they needed flour, sugar, coffee, medicine for her father, seeds for the spring planting. Necessities, not luxuries. While Mr. Henderson gathered the items, Elena stood as still as a statue, trying to make herself invisible. It never worked. "I heard her father's on his last legs," Mrs. Thornberry announced to the room at large, making no attempt at discretion. "What do you suppose will happen to her when he passes? That orchard's barely profitable as it is." "Maybe she'll find herself a husband," Melissa suggested, then dissolved into giggles. "Though I suppose he'd have to be blind, deaf, and desperate. And very, very strong," Tom Bradley added, "to carry all that weight across the threshold." The store erupted in laughter, cruel, cutting, the kind that left scars you couldn't see but felt every day of your life. Elena stared at the counter, at the scarred wood grain, at the jar of peppermint sticks that seemed to blur as her eyes burned with unshed tears. "Don't cry. Don't give them the satisfaction. Don't let them see." "Here you are, Miss Cross." Mr. Henderson placed the wrapped parcels on the counter, his movements brisk and businesslike. "That'll be $8 even." Elena counted out the coins with shaking hands, her vision swimming. $7, $7.50, $7.75, $8. Every penny she had in the world, handed over for the basics of survival. She was reaching for the parcels when a new voice cut through the din. A woman's voice, sharp as broken glass and twice as cutting. "Honestly, it's indecent," said Margaret Walsh, the mayor's wife, and the unofficial queen of Coldwater Springs society, parading around in a dress that tight. "It's practically obscene." "Maybe she doesn't know any better," Melissa offered with false sympathy. "After all, she doesn't exactly move in refined circles." "She doesn't move much at all by the look of it," Tom said. "Probably gets winded walking from the wagon to the door." Elena grabbed the parcels, hugging them to her chest like a shield. She needed to leave. Now. Before the tears came, before she gave them the final victory of seeing her completely broken. But as she turned toward the door, her path was blocked by a small crowd that had gathered, drawn by the spectacle of her humiliation like vultures to carrion. "Excuse me," she whispered, trying to edge past. "What's that?" Tom Bradley leaned in, cupping his ear in exaggerated fashion. "Can't hear you over all that heavy breathing. Probably all those stairs at that orchard," someone else suggested. "All that up and down would tire anyone out. Well, anyone her size anyway." Elena's chest tightened. The parcels felt impossibly heavy in her arms. The room was too hot, too small, the walls closing in with every cruel word. "Please," she said, louder this time. "I need to go." "Why the rush?" Melissa stepped into her path, all innocent smiles and venomous intent. "We're just having a friendly conversation. Surely you're not offended. We're only concerned for your health. All that weight can't be good for you." "My aunt had a figure like that," Mrs. Thornberry added. "Died at 40. Heart couldn't take the strain." "Tragic," Margaret Walsh said, shaking her head. "Simply tragic. Though I suppose if one refuses to show any restraint at the dinner table." Elena felt something crack inside her. A small, hairline fracture in the walls she'd built around her heart. She'd endured variations of this conversation her entire life. As a child, she'd been husky. As a teenager, big-boned. As an adult, she'd run out of euphemisms and been left with nothing but the cold, hard truth the world insisted on. She was fat, and therefore, she was worthless. She'd heard it from family members who meant well, from doctors who assumed every ailment stemmed from her weight, from potential suitors who'd made it clear that while she might have a pleasant face and a sharp mind, her body disqualified her from consideration. But somehow, hearing it here, now, in front of half the town, with her father dying at home and her future crumbling around her, it was too much. "If you'll excuse me," she started again, trying to push past. "Tell me, Miss Cross." Tom Bradley blocked her path more deliberately now, emboldened by the crowd's laughter. "Do you make that dress yourself, or is there a tent maker in town I don't know about?" The crowd roared. Elena felt the parcels slip in her grasp, and she clutched them tighter, her knuckles white. Heat burned behind her eyes. Her throat felt thick, closed up with all the words she wanted to scream but couldn't. "Why do you hate me? What did I do to deserve this? I'm a person. I have feelings. I work hard. I take care of my dying father. I'm kind to everyone I meet. Why isn't that enough? Why will it never be enough?" But she didn't say any of it. She just stood there, frozen, while the laughter crashed over her like waves, drowning her a little more with each passing second. "I think she's about to cry," Melissa observed with clinical detachment. "Look, her face is getting all red." Probably just overheated, someone else suggested. All that insulation. More laughter. Always more laughter. Elena felt the first tear slide down her cheek and hated herself for it. Hated her weakness, her sensitivity, her inability to just not care what these people thought. But she did care. Despite everything, she still cared, and that felt like the greatest failure of all. The door behind her opened, the bell chiming once more. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor, boot heels that rang with authority and purpose. The room's energy shifted, the laughter fading to uncertain murmurs. "Afternoon, folks," a man's voice said, deep, measured, with the kind of quiet strength that didn't need volume to command attention. "Seems like quite a gathering in here." Elena didn't turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, on her scuffed boots, and the dust that clung to them, waiting for this newcomer to join in the mockery or simply ignore her like everyone else who'd witnessed her degradation over the years. "Grant Mercer." "Mr." Henderson said, his tone suddenly deferential. "Didn't expect to see you in town today. Needed some supplies," the man, Grant, replied. His voice was closer now, just behind Elena's right shoulder. "But it seems I've walked into something. Care to explain what's so funny?" Silence fell like a guillotine blade. Elena felt the weight of his presence behind her, solid and immovable. Tom Bradley cleared his throat. "Just having a bit of fun, Mercer. No harm meant." "Funny thing about fun," Grant said, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel beneath it. "It's only fun when everyone's laughing. Doesn't look like everyone's laughing to me." Elena risked a glance up and immediately wished she hadn't. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass display case, red-faced, tear-streaked, clutching her parcels like a child holding on to a favorite toy. She looked pathetic, weak. Everything she hated about herself on full display. "We were just, that is..." Mrs. S. Thornberry stammered, apparently unaccustomed to being challenged. "We were merely commenting on Miss Cross's appearance, I'd wager," Grant interrupted. "Seems to be a favorite pastime in this town. Judging women, tearing them down, making yourselves feel bigger by making others feel small." The room went deathly quiet. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, loud and frantic in her ears. "Now see here," Margaret Walsh started, her voice indignant. "I don't know who you think you are. I think I'm someone who's had enough of watching good people get treated like dirt, while the likes of you stand around congratulating yourselves on your so-called virtue." Grant's voice was hard now, uncompromising. "You want to know what I see when I look around this room?" Nobody answered. "I see a bunch of small-minded hypocrites who've got nothing better to do than make sport of a woman who's shown more courage and strength in the last 5 minutes than the lot of you will manage in a lifetime." Elena's breath caught. She turned slowly, finally looking at the man who'd stepped, inexplicably, to her defense. Grant Mercer stood about 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and lean, in the way of men who worked hard for a living. He wore dusty trail clothes, denim pants, a dark shirt, scuffed boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed a face weathered by sun and wind. He couldn't have been much past 30, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes that were currently fixed on the crowd with unmistakable contempt. He was, Elena realized with a jolt, the most compelling man she'd ever seen. Not handsome in the conventional sense. His features were too rough, too lived-in for that, but arresting. The kind of man you couldn't look away from, even if you wanted to. And he was defending her, publicly, forcefully. It made no sense. "You don't understand," Melissa tried, her earlier confidence wavering. "We were just being cruel," Grant finished. "Call it what it is. You were mocking this woman for having the audacity to exist in a body that doesn't meet your narrow standards. As if any of you have the right to judge. As if your opinions matter a damn." "Mr. Mercer," Mr. Henderson tried, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation unfolding in his store. "Perhaps we should all just... You should all be ashamed," Grant said flatly. He turned then, his eyes meeting Elena's for the first time. "Miss Cross, is it?" Elena nodded mutely, unable to form words. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I apologize on behalf of these folks, though they should be doing it themselves. You deserve better than this." Elena's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Thank you. Don't thank me for basic human decency." He tipped his hat. That should be the bare minimum. Then he turned back to the crowd, and his face hardened again. I want to make something very clear to everyone in this room. Miss Cross here is worth 10 of any of you. She's out here working an orchard practically by herself, caring for her ailing father, surviving despite everything this town and life has thrown at her. What are you doing? Standing around a general store tearing down someone who's never done a damn thing to hurt you. You barely know her, Margaret Walsh protested, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. How can you possibly? I know enough. Grant's voice was absolute. I know she walks in here with her head held high despite knowing what awaits her. I know she doesn't retaliate, doesn't lash out, doesn't give you the satisfaction of a reaction. That takes strength, real strength, not the cheap, easy kind that comes from ganging up on someone who can't fight back. He took a step forward, and the crowd actually retreated slightly. Here's how it's going to be from now on, he continued. Miss Cross is going to be treated with respect in this town. Anyone who has a problem with that has a problem with me. And trust me, his smile was all teeth and no warmth. You don't want a problem with me. Tom Bradley opened his mouth, then wisely closed it again. Nothing to say now? Grant asked. Where'd all that courage go? All those clever jokes? Funny how it disappears when someone's actually willing to stand up for the target of your cruelty. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words settle over the room like a heavy blanket. Then he looked at Elena again, and his expression transformed. The hardness melted away, replaced by something gentler, almost kind. Miss Cross, would you allow me to help you carry those parcels to your wagon? Elena stared at him, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. Men like Grant Mercer didn't defend women like her. They didn't notice women like her except to join in the mockery, or at best, to offer pitying glances before moving on to someone more deserving of their attention. I can manage, she stammered, though the parcels were growing heavier by the second. I'm sure you can, Grant agreed, but you shouldn't have to. Not alone. Not after this. He held out his hands, and after a moment's hesitation, Elena let him take some of the parcels. His fingers brushed hers, calloused, work roughened, and she felt an electric shock of contact that made her breath catch. After you, he said, gesturing toward the door. Elena walked through the silent store, acutely aware of every eye on her, but for the first time in her life, the stares didn't feel entirely hostile. They felt confused, uncertain, as if Grant Mercer's words had somehow shifted the foundation of something everyone had accepted as immutable truth. The bell chimed as they stepped out into the fading afternoon light. Elena drew in a deep breath of fresh air, feeling like she'd been underwater and only just surfaced. Where's your wagon? Grant asked. Just there. She pointed to the tired-looking horse and wagon tied up at the hitching post. That's Bess, and the wagon. Good strong horse, Grant observed, loading the parcels into the wagon bed with practiced efficiency. You take good care of her. She's all we have for transport, Elena said, finding her voice again. My father can't. He's not well enough to ride anymore. So Bess pulls the wagon, and we manage. Grant nodded, his expression thoughtful. When all the parcels were loaded, he turned to face her fully, and Elena had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. They were brown, she noticed, deep brown, like rich earth or good coffee. Miss Cross, he said slowly, as if choosing his words with care, I want to apologize again for what happened in there. Nobody should have to endure that kind of treatment. You don't need to apologize, Elena said quietly. You weren't part of it. You defended me. I don't understand why, but thank you. You don't understand why? Grant's eyebrows rose. Because it was the right thing to do. Because those people were being cruel, and someone needed to say so. But you don't know me. The words tumbled out before Elena could stop them. Why would you risk making enemies in town for a stranger, especially a stranger like me? A stranger like you? Grant repeated, his tone carefully neutral. What does that mean? Elena gestured helplessly at herself, at her body, at everything she knew the world saw when they looked at her. You know what I mean? Grant was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and sincere in a way that made Elena's chest tighten. Miss Cross, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to really hear it. Can you do that? Elena nodded, uncertain where this was going. What I see when I look at you, Grant said deliberately, is a woman who's stronger than anyone in that store. A woman who faces cruelty with dignity. A woman who works hard, cares for her family, and keeps going despite everything. That's what I see. Not whatever garbage those narrow-minded fools tried to make you believe about yourself. Elena felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different from the ones she'd shed inside. These weren't tears of shame and humiliation. These were something else entirely, something unfamiliar and almost painful in its intensity. "I don't," she started, then stopped, unsure how to finish. "You don't have to say anything," Grant said gently. "I just wanted you to know. You're worth defending, Miss Cross. Worth respect. Don't let anyone tell you different." He tipped his hat again, a gesture so old-fashioned and courteous it made Elena's heart stutter. "I should let you get home to your father," he continued, "but if you don't mind, I'd like to call on you sometime. See that orchard of yours. I've heard it's quite something." You want to visit?" Elena couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. "Why?" "Because I'm interested," Grant said simply. "In the orchard. In how you manage it. He paused. "In getting to know you better, if you'll allow it." Elena's mind spun. This had to be a joke. An elaborate setup for more humiliation. Men like Grant Mercer didn't express interest in women like Elena Cross. It wasn't how the world worked. But his eyes were steady, sincere, without a trace of mockery or pity. Elena swallowed hard. "Yes, I mean, you're welcome to visit. The orchard is about 3 miles northeast of town. The Cross Orchard. There's a sign." "The Cross Orchard," Grant repeated, smiling. "I'll find it. Tomorrow afternoon, if that suits you?" "Tomorrow is fine." "Good." He stepped back, giving her space to climb onto the wagon seat. "Travel safe, Miss Cross. And please don't give those people in there another thought. They're not worth your time or your tears." Elena gathered the reins in trembling hands. "Mr. Mercer, why are you being so kind to me?" Grant's smile widened, reaching his eyes this time. "Maybe I just recognize quality when I see it." Before Elena could respond, he turned and walked back into the general store, leaving her sitting alone on the wagon, her mind reeling and her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear or shame. She clucked to Bess, and the old horse started the familiar journey home. But Elena barely noticed the passing scenery. Her thoughts were entirely occupied by the events of the last 20 minutes. Grant Mercer had defended her, publicly, forcefully. He'd called out the town's cruelty and declared her worthy of respect. And then, impossibly, he'd asked to call on her. It couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. Men didn't look at Elena Cross with interest. They looked through her, or at her with disgust, or, if she was lucky, with indifferent tolerance. But Grant Mercer had looked at her like she mattered. The wagon rattled over the familiar rutted road, past farms and fields Elena had known her whole life. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Normally, Elena would have appreciated the beauty of it, but tonight she was too lost in thought to notice. What would her father say when she told him about this? Would he share her skepticism, or would he, in his gentle, hopeful way, encourage her to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone could see past her appearance to the person beneath? The Cross Orchard came into view as Elena rounded the last bend, 20 acres of apple trees in various stages of growth, spreading across the hillside like a patchwork quilt. The house sat at the bottom of the hill, a modest 2-room cabin her father had built 30 years ago, when he'd first staked his claim to this land. It wasn't much, but it was home. The only home Elena had ever known. She pulled Bess to a stop near the porch and climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady. The parcels could wait a few minutes. First, she needed to check on her father. James Cross was where she'd left him, in the rocking chair by the window, a blanket draped over his lap despite the warmth of the evening. At 56, he looked 20 years older, his frame wasted by the consumption that was slowly stealing him away. But his eyes were still sharp, still kind, and they fixed on Elena with immediate concern as she entered. "Elena?" His voice was thin, reedy. "You're pale. What happened?" Elena sank onto the stool beside his chair, suddenly exhausted. "Nothing, Papa. Just the usual. You know how it is in town." "I know how it is," James said quietly. "I also know my daughter. Something's different. Tell me." So she did. She told him about the scene in the general store, about the laughter and the cruel words. She told him about Grant Mercer stepping in, defending her, carrying her parcels. And finally, hesitantly, she told him about the invitation to call on her tomorrow. James was silent for a long moment after she finished, his weathered hand stroking his beard thoughtfully. "This Grant Mercer," he finally said. "You believe he was sincere?" "I don't know what to believe, Papa." Elena's voice cracked slightly. "Why would someone like him be interested in someone like me?" "Someone like you?" James reached out and took her hand, his grip weak but warm. "Elena, look at me." She met his eyes, seeing the love there, the unwavering faith he'd always had in her. "You are my greatest achievement," he said simply. "Not this orchard, not this land. You. Your strength, your kindness, your resilience. Any man would be lucky to know you, let alone court you." "Papa, you're my father. You're supposed to say that." "I'm saying it because it's true." James squeezed her hand. "I won't be here much longer, my girl. We both know it. And it eats at me, thinking of you alone, thinking of you believing the lies this world has told you about yourself." "Papa, let me finish." His voice was gentle but firm. "I've watched you carry the weight of other people's judgment your whole life. I've seen how it's wounded you, how you've come to believe they're poison. But Elena, you are not what they say you are. You're not too much or not enough or any of the other cruel things they've whispered behind your back." Tears slid down Elena's cheeks. "Then what am I?" "You're exactly who you're meant to be." James smiled, though the effort seemed to cost him. "And if this Grant Mercer has the good sense to see that, then maybe you should give him a chance. Maybe you should give yourself a chance." "I'm scared," Elena whispered. "Of course you are. Fear means it matters." James settled back in his chair, his breathing labored. "But Elena, I need you to promise me something." "Anything, Papa." "Promise me you won't let fear keep you from living. Promise me that when I'm gone, you'll find your happiness, whatever that looks like. Promise me you'll stop punishing yourself for not fitting into a mold someone else created." "Papa, don't talk like that. You're not—" "Promise me." His voice was fading, exhaustion taking its toll. Elena wiped her eyes. "I promise." "Good." James closed his eyes. "Now tell me about the supplies. Did Henderson have everything on the list?" They talked for a while longer about mundane things, the orchard, the coming harvest, repairs needed on the barn. Normal, everyday conversation that felt precious because Elena knew how numbered these moments were. When her father finally drifted off to sleep, Elena stood and stretched, her back aching from the day's tension. She needed to unload the wagon, make dinner, check the irrigation system in the orchard, mend the tear in the barn door. The list was endless, and she was only one person. But tonight, as she worked through her evening chores, something was different. Grant Mercer's words kept echoing in her mind. "You're worth defending, Miss Cross. Worth respect." Nobody had ever said that to her before. Not with such conviction, such certainty. Could it be true? Could she actually be worth something beyond her appearance, beyond society's narrow definitions of acceptable? Elena didn't have answers. But as she fell into bed that night, exhausted and emotionally wrung out, she found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She allowed herself to hope. Just a little. Just enough to wonder what tomorrow might bring when Grant Mercer rode up to the cross orchard and saw her not in town, under the weight of hostile stares, but here, in the place she'd built with her own two hands, doing the work she was proud of, being the person she actually was, instead of the caricature others had made her into. Maybe he'd see what her father saw. Maybe he'd understand why she loved this land, these trees, this life she'd carved out against all odds. Or maybe tomorrow would bring disappointment. Maybe Grant Mercer would realize his mistake, would see her in the harsh light of day, and understand why the town treated her the way they did. Elena didn't know which possibility frightened her more, being seen or being invisible again. But her promise to her father echoed in the darkness. She wouldn't let fear keep her from living. So when sleep finally claimed her, Elena Cross dreamed not of humiliation and shame, but of possibility. And somewhere in the night, on a ranch several miles away, Grant Mercer lay awake thinking about a woman with sad eyes and quiet strength, wondering if tomorrow would be the day he could show her what he'd seen in that general store, not a target for mockery, but a person worth knowing, worth defending, worth everything, Elena woke before dawn, as she always did, but this morning felt different. The familiar weight of dread that usually accompanied her into consciousness was replaced by something else, a flutter of nervous anticipation that made her stomach clench and her heart race. Grant Mercer was coming today. She lay in bed for a moment, staring at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, trying to convince herself that yesterday had actually happened, that a man had defended her in front of the entire town, that he'd asked to visit her orchard, that he'd looked at her like she was someone worth seeing. In the pale light filtering through her window, doubt crept in easily. Maybe she'd misunderstood his intentions. Maybe he was just being polite, the way some people performed kindness like a duty rather than a genuine feeling. Maybe he'd show up, take a cursory look around, and leave. His obligation to basic human decency fulfilled. Or maybe he wouldn't come at all. Elena pushed the blankets aside and stood, her feet finding the cold wooden floor. She couldn't afford to waste time on speculation. The orchard didn't care about her anxieties, and her father needed his morning medicine. She dressed quickly in her work clothes. A simple gray dress that was already patched in 3 places, sturdy boots, and an apron that had seen better days. Then she moved quietly through the cabin, not wanting to wake her father yet. He needed all the rest he could get. The kitchen was small but clean, everything in its place because there was so little to begin with. Elena measured out oats for breakfast, filled the kettle with water from the pump, and began the ritual of morning tasks that had shaped her life for as long as she could remember. While the water heated, she stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of apple blossoms from the orchard. This was her favorite time of day, before the world woke up, before judgment and scrutiny, when it was just Elena and the land and the quiet promise of a new beginning. She walked the perimeter of the nearest section of trees, checking for signs of disease or pest damage, her practiced eye catching details most people would miss. The irrigation channels needed clearing in the eastern section. Several trees required pruning. The fence along the north border was leaning dangerously and would need repair before winter. The list of tasks was endless, and Elena was only one person with limited time and even more limited resources. But this orchard was hers. Well, her father's legally, but hers in every way that mattered. She'd learned the work from him, improved upon his methods, coaxed life from stubborn soil and temperamental trees. When people in town mocked her, they saw only her body. They didn't see her hands, calloused from years of hard labor. They didn't see her mind, sharp and constantly calculating yields, expenses, market prices. They didn't see her heart, poured into every tree, every blossom, every hard-won apple. But maybe Grant Mercer would see it. Maybe. The sky was lightening to gray when Elena returned to the cabin. Her father was awake, sitting in his chair by the window, watching the sunrise paint the orchard in shades of gold and amber. "Morning, Papa," Elena said softly, bringing him a cup of weak tea, all they could afford, and the medicine the doctor had prescribed. "Morning, my girl." James's voice was stronger today, which Elena took as a good sign. "Big day ahead." "It's just another day?" Elena said, trying to sound casual as she helped him with the medicine. "Same as any other. Is that why you've already been out to check the trees? Why you're wearing your second-best dress instead of your work clothes?" Elena looked down and realized with a start that she'd unconsciously changed after returning from the orchard, putting on the calico dress from yesterday. The one that was too tight, the one that had invited so much mockery, because it was still better than her actual work dress, which was practically falling apart. I wanted to look presentable," she admitted. James smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "He'll be impressed by the orchard, Elena, by the work you've done here. That's what matters. If he even comes." "He'll come." Her father's confidence was absolute. "I saw it in your face yesterday when you told me about him. Whatever else that man might be, he's not a liar." Elena wanted to believe that. She busied herself making breakfast, oats sweetened with a precious spoonful of honey, day-old bread toasted over the stove. They ate in comfortable silence, the morning light growing stronger through the windows. After breakfast, Elena threw herself into work with almost desperate energy. She needed to stay busy, needed to keep her hands occupied and her mind focused on something other than the anxious waiting. She cleared the irrigation channels, pruned 3 trees that had been on her list for weeks, and was halfway through mending the north fence when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Elena's heart jumped into her throat. She straightened slowly, pushing a strand of hair back from her face, acutely aware of how she must look. Sweaty, dirt-streaked, her dress dusty and her hands grimy from work. A rider appeared at the bend in the road, and even from a distance, Elena recognized the broad shoulders and confident posture of Grant Mercer. He sat his horse like a man who'd been born in the saddle, easy and natural. He was actually here. He'd actually come. Elena wiped her hands on her apron, a futile gesture since the apron was as dirty as her hands, and walked down the hill to meet him. Her legs felt unsteady, and she was suddenly grateful for the years of farm work that had given her strength and endurance. At least she wouldn't stumble and make an even bigger fool of herself. Grant reined in his horse, a beautiful chestnut mare, and dismounted with fluid grace. Today he wore clean trail clothes, his dark hair slightly damp as if he'd made an effort to wash before coming. The realization that he'd prepared for this visit, that it mattered enough to him to clean up, made something warm unfold in Elena's chest. "Miss Cross," he said, removing his hat. "Hope I'm not too early." "No, not at all." Elena's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I've been up since dawn. Farm hours, you know." "I do know." Grant's eyes crinkled with what looked like genuine amusement. "I run a cattle ranch about 8 miles west of here. The Mercer Ranch. Dawn is sleeping in for me most days." A rancher. That explained the calloused hands, the weathered face, the way he moved with the kind of confidence that came from years of hard physical work. "Would you like to see the orchard?" Elena asked, gesturing toward the hillside of trees. "I'd like that very much." Grant tied his mare to the fence post. "Lead the way." They walked up the hill side by side, and Elena was acutely aware of the contrast between them. Grant moved with easy confidence, his long strides eating up the ground. Elena felt awkward and ungainly beside him, her dress clinging uncomfortably in the heat, her breathing already becoming labored from the climb. But if Grant noticed her struggle, he gave no sign. Instead, he was looking around with what appeared to be genuine interest. "How many acres?" he asked. 20, not all planted yet. We've only got about 15 acres of producing trees. The rest is still young growth." Elena found her footing as they talked about familiar territory. "Mostly apples. Some pears in the south section. We do well enough at market, but it's a lot of work for 2 people. And with my father ill..." She trailed off, not wanting to burden this near stranger with her problems. But Grant nodded understanding. "I can imagine. Even with a full crew, ranching is hard work. Can't be easy managing all this essentially on your own." "I manage." Elena kept her voice neutral. "The trees don't care if I'm tired, or if my back hurts, or if I'd rather be doing something else. They need tending, so I tend them." They reached the top of the hill, where the oldest trees stood, gnarled and strong, their branches heavy with developing fruit. Grant stopped, looking out over the orchard with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "The organization, the health of the trees, the irrigation system. Miss Cross, this is professional-level work." Elena felt heat rise to her face that had nothing to do with the climbing sun. "My father taught me. He's been working this land for 30 years. I do what he showed me. Don't sell yourself short." Grant turned to look at her directly. "I've seen plenty of orchards in my time, and most of them don't look this good. You've got a gift for this." "It's just hard work," Elena protested, uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone could do it if they put in the time." "That's not true, and I think you know it." Grant walked over to one of the trees, examining the pruning cuts with a practiced eye. "This takes knowledge, skill, dedication. You should be proud of what you've built here." Built, not maintained, not inherited. Built. The words settled into Elena's chest like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she understood about herself and her place in the world. "Can I ask you something?" The question was out before Elena could stop it. Grant turned back to her. "Of course. Why are you really here?" Elena forced herself to meet his eyes. "Yesterday, in town, you defended me. Today you're here, complimenting my work, acting like I'm someone worth your time. I don't understand why." Grant was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "Can I be honest with you, Miss Cross?" "I'd prefer it." I came to Coldwater Springs 3 months ago to expand my ranching operation. Bought land, hired crew, started building, and in that time, I've watched how this town operates, how people treat each other, who gets respect and who gets stepped on. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I've seen you in town before yesterday, watched how people treated you, and I've heard the talk about your father's illness, about you running this place alone, about, he hesitated, about how folks judge you for things that have nothing to do with your character or your worth. Elena felt her defenses rising. So you pity me? No. Grant's response was immediate and firm. I admire you. There's a difference. Admire me? Elena couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. For what? For being the town joke? For being too fat to... Don't. Grant's voice was sharp enough to stop her mid-sentence. Don't repeat their poison like it's truth. You want to know what I admire? Your strength, your resilience, the way you keep going despite everything they throw at you. That's not weakness, Miss Cross. That's courage. Elena stared at him, something tight in her chest beginning to crack. I grew up poor, Grant continued, his voice quieter now. Dirt poor. My mother raised me and my sister alone after my father died. We had nothing, less than nothing, and people looked at us the same way they look at you, like we were less than, like we didn't matter. He looked out over the orchard, his jaw tight with old memories. My mother worked herself to death trying to prove them wrong. Died when I was 16, still trying to earn respect from people who would never give it. And I swore then that I'd never judge someone based on circumstances beyond their control, that I'd see people for who they are, not what society says they should be. I'm sorry, Elena said softly. About your mother. Grant nodded acknowledgement. Point is, when I saw what was happening in that store yesterday, I saw my mother, I saw my sister, I saw every person who's ever been judged and found wanting by people who have no right to judge, and I couldn't stay silent. But coming here today, Elena pressed, still not quite able to believe this was real. That's different from defending someone in the moment. Why seek me out? Grant met her eyes, and the honesty in his gaze made Elena's breath catch. Because when I defended you yesterday, I meant what I said. You're worth 10 of those people, and I wanted to see for myself what they were too blind to notice. I wanted to see the woman behind the cruelty, the person they refused to acknowledge. And now that you have? Elena's voice was barely a whisper. Now that I have, Grant said slowly, I'd like to get to know you better, if you'll allow it. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and danger in equal measure. Elena wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that this man, this strong, capable, impossibly kind man, actually wanted to know her, but years of rejection and humiliation had taught her to protect herself. Mr. Mercer. Grant, please. Grant. His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate. I appreciate your kindness, I do. But I need you to understand something. She took a breath, gathering courage. I'm not what men want. I know that. I've always known that. And I've made my peace with it. I have my orchard, my father, my work. That's enough. It has to be enough because anything else is just... It's not possible for someone like me. Someone like you, Grant repeated, and there was something almost angry in his voice. You keep saying that. Someone like you. What does that even mean? You know what it means, Elena gestured helplessly at herself. Look at me, Grant. Really look. I'm not pretty. I'm not delicate. I'm not any of the things a woman is supposed to be. I'm too big, too awkward, too strong, Grant interrupted. Too capable, too intelligent, too resilient. That's not what people see. Then people are idiots. Grant took a step closer, his intensity almost overwhelming. You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see a woman who's survived things that would break most people. I see someone who works harder than anyone I've ever met. I see intelligence in your eyes, and strength in your shoulders, and grace in the way you move through your orchard like you're dancing with the trees. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. You can't mean that. Why can't I? Grant's voice gentled. Why is it so hard to believe that I might see something different than what those small-minded gossips see? Because no one ever has before, Elena whispered, the admission tearing itself from somewhere deep inside. My whole life, I've been too much, too big, too loud, too hungry, too present. I take up too much space in a world that wants me to disappear, and I've learned to accept that, to expect it. But you're standing here saying things that sound too good to be true, and I don't know how to trust that. Grant was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I can't change what other people have done to you. Can't undo all those years of cruelty. But Elena, her name on his lips sent shivers down her spine. I'm asking you to give me a chance. Let me prove that not everyone is like them. Let me show you how I see you. And how is that? Elena asked, barely daring to hope. Clearly, Grant said simply. I see you clearly. They stood there on the hillside, the morning sun warm on their faces, the orchard spreading out below them like a promise. Elena felt something shifting inside her, old foundations cracking to make room for something new and terrifying and wonderful. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. How to let someone in. Then we'll figure it out together. Grant's smile was gentle. No pressure, Elena. Just give me a chance. Let me visit sometimes. Let me help with the work if you need it. Let me be your friend, if nothing else. Friend. The word felt both safer and more dangerous than anything else he might have offered. Friends, Elena repeated, testing the word. I can try that. That's all I'm asking. Grant looked genuinely relieved. Now, how about you show me the rest of this operation? I want to see everything. So she did. They spent the next 2 hours walking through the orchard, Elena explaining her cultivation techniques, the challenges of managing the irrigation, her plans for expansion. Grant asked intelligent questions, offered observations that showed he understood the work, and listened, really listened, in a way Elena had never experienced before. He didn't talk over her, didn't dismiss her knowledge, didn't act like her expertise was surprising or unusual coming from a woman. He just listened, learned, respected. They were examining the young pear trees in the south section. When Grant asked, "What's your biggest challenge right now? Besides your father's illness, I mean." Elena considered the question. Labor, mostly. There's so much that needs doing, and I can only be in one place at a time. The harvest is coming in 2 months, and I usually hire day workers from town, but... She trailed off. But they make it difficult, Grant finished for her. They make it impossible, Elena corrected. Last year, half the workers didn't show up. The ones who did spent more time mocking me than working. I lost a quarter of my crop because I couldn't get it picked and processed fast enough. Grant's jaw tightened. That's criminal. This orchard produces good fruit. You deserve workers who'll do their jobs. Deserve doesn't factor into it much, Elena said with a bitter laugh. I'll make do. I always do. What if you didn't have to just make do? Grant leaned against one of the trees, his posture casual but his eyes intense. What if you had help, real help, from people who'd show up and work hard and treat you with respect? Elena frowned, confused. Where would I find workers like that? My ranch. Grant said it like it was obvious. I've got a crew of about a dozen men. Good workers. Respectful. Honest. During harvest season, ranching slows down a bit. I could spare 3 or 4 of them to help you bring in your crop. Elena's heart jumped, but she forced herself to be practical. I can't afford to pay what you must pay your ranch hands. I'm not asking you to pay them. Grant held up a hand to forestall her protest. Hear me out. You've got knowledge I need. I'm trying to diversify the ranch, add some crops, maybe plant some fruit trees of my own. I don't know the first thing about cultivation, but you do. He straightened, and Elena could see the businessman emerging beneath the kind stranger. So here's my proposal. You teach me what you know about growing things. Share your expertise. In exchange, I'll provide labor during your harvest season. Fair trade. No charity. No pity. Just 2 professionals helping each other out. Elena stared at him, her mind racing. It was a good offer. More than good. It was exactly what she needed. But accepting felt dangerous, like opening a door she might not be able to close. Why would you do this? She asked. Your time is worth more than my teaching. Is it? Grant challenged. I can hire ranch hands anywhere. But finding someone who actually knows how to coax life from difficult soil, who understands the patience and care it takes to build something lasting, that's rare, Elena. That's valuable. The way he said her name, like it mattered, like she mattered, made Elena's chest tight. I need to think about it, she said finally. Fair enough. Grant didn't seem offended. Take all the time you need. The offer stands. They walked back toward the cabin in comfortable silence. Elena's mind was churning with possibilities and doubts in equal measure. This could be the answer to her problems. Reliable help, a fair exchange, maybe even the salvation of the orchard. But it also meant letting Grant Mercer into her life more deeply, and that scared her more than she wanted to admit. When they reached the cabin, James was sitting on the porch, wrapped in his blanket despite the warmth of the day. He looked frail in the bright sunlight, his illness impossible to ignore. "Papa," Elena called out, "we have a visitor." Grant approached the porch and extended his hand. "Mr. Cross, I'm Grant Mercer. It's an honor to meet you, sir." James shook his hand, his grip weak but his eyes sharp as he assessed the younger man. "Mercer, you're the one who stood up for my girl in town." "I did what anyone should have done, sir." "But most didn't." James gestured to the other chair on the porch. "Sit. Tell me about yourself." Elena watched as Grant settled into the chair, answering her father's questions with patience and honesty. He talked about his ranch, his plans for expansion, his desire to learn cultivation. He didn't shy away from mentioning his difficult childhood or his mother's struggles. He met James's eyes directly, showing respect but not deference. And James, Elena could see, was impressed. Her father had always been a good judge of character, and whatever he saw in Grant Mercer seemed to satisfy something deep inside him. "You know what my daughter's capable of?" James asked suddenly. "I'm beginning to," Grant replied, "though I suspect I've only scratched the surface." "She's smarter than I ever was," James said, pride clear in his voice. "Took what I taught her and improved on it. This orchard is twice as productive as it was when I ran it alone. That's all Elena's doing." "Papa," Elena protested, embarrassed. "It's true, and he should know it." James looked at Grant seriously. "My time is short, Mr. Mercer. I won't see another harvest, and it weighs on me thinking of Elena here alone with no one to help her, no one to see her value." "Mr. Cross?" Grant started. "Let me finish." James's voice was firm despite its weakness. "I'm not asking you to marry her or make promises you can't keep. But if you're sincere in wanting to help, in wanting to know her, then I'm asking you to be patient, to be kind. My daughter has been wounded by this world in ways that don't show on the surface. Trust doesn't come easy to her anymore." "I understand, sir," Grant said quietly. "And I give you my word. I'll be patient. I'll be worthy of whatever trust she chooses to give me." James nodded, satisfied. "Then you're welcome here, Mr. Mercer. Anytime." The conversation drifted to lighter topics after that: weather, market prices, the upcoming county fair. Elena brought out water and some of the apples from last year's harvest, preserved in the root cellar. They sat on the porch, three people sharing a simple moment that felt to Elena like something precious and fragile. Eventually, Grant stood to leave. "I should get back to the ranch. But Elena, will you think about my offer?" "I will," she promised. "Good." He turned to James. "Mr. Cross, it was a pleasure meeting you." "Likewise, son. Come back soon." Elena walked Grant to his horse, her heart pounding. At the fence, he paused, his hand on the mare's reins. "Thank you for today," he said, "for showing me the orchard, for giving me a chance." "I should be thanking you," Elena replied, "for the offer, for everything." Grant smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger, almost boyish. "How about we call it even?" He swung into the saddle with easy grace, looking down at her with an expression that made Elena's stomach flutter. "I meant what I said, Elena, about seeing you clearly. I hope eventually you'll believe that." Before Elena could respond, he touched his hat in farewell and rode off, his horse kicking up dust as they headed down the road toward town. Elena stood there long after he disappeared from view, her mind reeling. When she finally turned back to the cabin, she found her father watching her with knowing eyes. "He's a good man," James said simply. "You can't know that after one conversation." "I know enough," her father smiled. "And more importantly, I saw how he looks at you, like you're something precious, something worth protecting." "Papa, don't." Elena sank into the chair Grant had vacated, its wood still warm from his presence. "Don't get your hopes up. He's just being kind, that's all." "Is it?" James reached over and took her hand. "Elena, I've been watching people my whole life, and that man isn't being kind out of obligation or pity. He's genuinely interested in you, in getting to know you. Why would he be? The question came out small, vulnerable. Because you're worth knowing, James said, the same certainty in his voice that Grant had shown. When are you going to believe that? Elena didn't have an answer. She sat with her father as the afternoon wore on, processing everything that had happened, trying to reconcile the world she'd always known, where she was too much and not enough all at once, with this new possibility that maybe, just maybe, someone could see her differently. That night, after helping her father to bed and finishing her evening chores, Elena stood at her bedroom window looking out at the orchard. The moon was bright enough to see the trees, their leaves silver in the darkness, promising fruit yet to come. Grant Mercer had been here, in her orchard, in her space, and he'd seen it, really seen it, and found it worthy, found her worthy. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Elena pulled out the small journal she kept hidden in her dresser drawer, the one place she allowed herself to be completely honest, to write down the thoughts and feelings she could never speak aloud. She'd been keeping it since she was 12, chronicling her experiences with the world's cruelty, using writing as a way to process pain she couldn't otherwise express. But tonight, for the first time in years, she wrote something different. Today, someone saw me, she wrote, her handwriting shaky in the candlelight. Not the body they've decided defines me. Not the shame they've tried to make me wear, but me. The person I am underneath all their expectations and judgments, and he didn't look away. She paused, pen hovering over paper, then continued. I don't know if I can trust this. Don't know if I should. But Papa says to give it a chance. Grant says to give him a chance. And maybe I owe it to myself to try. To stop living in the prison their words built around me and see if there's a world outside these walls. Elena closed the journal and pressed it to her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart beneath her hand. She was scared, terrified actually, but beneath the fear was something else, a tiny spark of hope that refused to be extinguished no matter how hard she tried to protect herself from disappointment. Tomorrow she would work the orchard as always. She would care for her father and mend fences and check irrigation channels and do all the 1,000 small tasks that made up her life. But underneath it all, she would be thinking about Grant Mercer's offer, about partnership and respect, and the possibility that maybe she didn't have to face everything alone anymore. And when sleep finally came, Elena dreamed not of mocking laughter and cruel words, but of strong hands helping with the harvest, of patient teaching and eager learning, of being seen and valued for exactly who she was. The dreams felt dangerous. They felt like promises that couldn't be kept, hopes that would inevitably be crushed. But they also felt like possibility. And that, Elena was beginning to realize, was sometimes worth the risk. 3 days passed before Grant returned, and in those 3 days, Elena had convinced herself a dozen times that he wouldn't come back at all. That his interest had been momentary, a spark of kindness that would fade under the harsh light of reality. That she'd been foolish to hope for anything different. But on the 4th day, just after noon when the sun was at its highest and Elena was elbow-deep in mud trying to fix a broken irrigation line, she heard hoofbeats again. She looked up to find Grant dismounting near the barn, and this time he wasn't alone. 3 men rode with him, all dressed for work, all looking around the orchard with professional interest. Elena stood slowly, acutely aware of how she must look, covered in mud, hair falling out of its bun, sweat streaking her face. She wiped her hands uselessly on her apron and walked toward them, her heart hammering. "Elena," Grant called out, his smile warm and genuine. "Hope we're not interrupting." "I was just fixing the irrigation line in the east section," she said, hating how breathless she sounded. "It broke this morning." "Perfect timing, then," Grant gestured to the men behind him. "This is Carlos, Ben, and Thomas. They work my ranch, and they've agreed to help with some of the heavier repairs around here, if you'll have us." Elena stared at the 3 men, who nodded respectfully. They looked capable, strong, and most surprisingly, they weren't laughing at her or sneaking mocking glances. They were just waiting, tools in hand, ready to work. I haven't agreed to your offer yet," Elena said to Grant, confused. "I know." Grant's expression was patient. "But you've got a broken irrigation line and a fence that's about to fall over, and I've got men in time. So how about we help anyway, and you can decide about the rest later." "I can't pay you for this," Elena protested. "Didn't ask you to." Grant was already moving toward the barn. Just show us what needs doing. For a moment, Elena stood frozen, torn between pride and practicality. Then she thought of her father's words about not punishing herself, about allowing help when it was offered in good faith. She thought of the endless list of repairs she couldn't manage alone, of the harvest coming closer every day. The irrigation line first, she said finally, leading them toward the east section. Then the north fence, and there's a section of the barn roof that's been leaking since last winter. What followed was the strangest afternoon of Elena's life. The men worked with quiet efficiency, following her directions without question or complaint. Grant insisted on being shown exactly how the irrigation system worked, asking detailed questions and taking mental notes. Carlos turned out to have carpentry skills and tackled the barn roof with enthusiasm. Ben and Thomas handled the fence repairs like they'd been doing it their whole lives. And through it all, not one of them made a single comment about Elena's appearance, not one mocking glance or barely suppressed laugh. They treated her like what she was, the owner of the property, someone whose knowledge and expertise they respected. It was so unexpected that Elena found herself watching them suspiciously at first, waiting for the cruelty she'd learned to expect. But it never came. They just worked, paused occasionally to ask her opinion on something, then went back to working. "You've got a good setup here," Carlos said during a water break, wiping sweat from his brow. "Smart irrigation design. Whoever planned this knew what they were doing." "I planned it," Elena said, unable to keep the defensive edge from her voice. Carlos's eyebrows rose. "Then you know what you're doing, ma'am. It's quality work." The simple acknowledgement, delivered without condescension or surprise, made Elena's throat tight. By late afternoon, the irrigation line was fixed, the fence was secure, and the barn roof no longer leaked. The four men gathered their tools, and Elena found herself struggling to find adequate words. "Thank you," she said, knowing it wasn't enough. "This would have taken me weeks to do alone." "Happy to help," Grant said. He hesitated, then added, "We'll come back tomorrow if that's all right. There's more that needs doing, and the boys here are enjoying the change of pace from ranch work. Aren't you, boys?" The three ranch hands nodded agreement, and Elena realized with a start that they genuinely seemed to mean it. They'd enjoyed working here, on her orchard, under her direction. "Tomorrow, then," she heard herself say, "if you're sure." "We're sure," Grant said firmly. "See you at first light." They came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. What started as a simple repair job evolved into something else entirely, a partnership that neither of them had quite planned, but that seemed to grow naturally out of necessity and mutual respect. Grant was true to his word about wanting to learn cultivation. He arrived early each morning and stayed late into the evening, absorbing everything Elena taught him about soil composition, pruning techniques, pest management. He had a sharp mind and asked intelligent questions, pushing her to explain not just what to do, but why. "Why prune in late winter instead of fall?" he asked one afternoon as they worked side by side in the orchard. "Because the tree is dormant then," Elena explained, demonstrating the proper cutting angle. "It's not actively growing, so the pruning wound heals better. Plus you can see the branch structure more clearly without leaves in the way." "Makes sense," Grant mimicked her cutting technique on the next branch. "Like this?" "Exactly like that. Like..." Elena felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with embarrassment. "You're a quick study. I've got a good teacher." The compliment was simple, straightforward, but it warmed Elena in a way she wasn't quite prepared for. She'd spent so long being invisible or mocked that being seen, truly seen and appreciated for her knowledge, felt almost overwhelming. As the weeks passed, a routine developed. Grant and his men would arrive at dawn. They'd work until midday, taking a break when the sun was hottest. Elena started preparing lunch for everyone. Simple fare, bread and cheese, and apples from the cold storage. But it was her way of contributing something back. The men would eat on the porch, talking easily about work and weather and the upcoming county fair. James grew stronger in spirit, if not in body, during this time, energized by the activity around the orchard and by watching his daughter slowly come alive in a way he'd never seen before. He and Grant developed an easy friendship, spending hours on the porch discussing everything from cattle breeding to politics to the best way to make coffee over an open fire. "He's good for you," James told Elena one evening after Grant had left. "I can see it in your eyes. You're happier." "I'm just grateful for the help," Elena protested, but her father saw through her immediately. "You're allowed to be happy, Elena. You're allowed to enjoy someone's company. You're allowed to feel whatever it is you're feeling. Elena looked away, uncomfortable with how transparent she apparently was. The truth was, she was feeling things she'd never expected to feel. When Grant arrived each morning, her heart would lift. When he smiled at her across the orchard, her stomach would flutter. When their hands accidentally brushed reaching for the same tool, electricity would shoot through her entire body. She was falling for him, slowly, terrifyingly, inevitably. And that scared her more than anything else in her life ever had. Because what happened when Grant realized what she was? When the novelty of teaching wore off, and he saw her, really saw her, the way the rest of the town did, when he understood that caring about her came with mockery and judgment and social consequences, Elena tried to guard her heart, tried to maintain distance, but Grant made it impossible. He was patient and kind and genuinely interested in everything about her. He asked about her childhood, her dreams, her thoughts on everything from farming techniques to literature to what she thought about the territorial governor's latest policies. He treated her like an equal, like someone whose opinions mattered, like a person worth knowing. And slowly, against her better judgment, Elena began to believe him. The breaking point came 6 weeks after Grant's first visit, at the monthly town social. Elena hadn't planned to go. She never went to town events if she could avoid them, but her father insisted. "You can't hide forever," James said, his voice weak but determined. "Grant will be there. His men will be there. You'll have allies this time." "Papa, I don't need allies. I just need to avoid humiliation." Living in fear of other people's cruelty isn't living, Elena. It's surviving. There's a difference. James gripped her hand with surprising strength. "I want to see you live before I die. Really live. Please." So Elena found herself standing in front of her small mirror that Saturday evening, staring at her reflection with the same critical eyes she'd developed over years of hearing other people's judgments. She'd made a new dress for the occasion, the first new dress she'd sewn in over a year. It was deep blue, simple but well made, and she designed it specifically to fit her body instead of trying to hide it. The neckline was modest but showed the curve of her shoulders. The waist was fitted without being tight. The skirt fell in clean lines that didn't cling awkwardly. It was, she realized with a start, a dress made for a woman who wasn't ashamed of her body. A dress made by someone who'd spent the last 6 weeks being treated like her appearance was the least interesting thing about her. Looking at her reflection, Elena saw herself differently than she had in years. Yes, she was larger than society said women should be. Yes, her arms were thick with muscle from years of farm work. Yes, her face was flushed from sun and wind rather than powdered pale like the society ladies. But she was also strong, capable, intelligent, worthy. Grant had shown her that, not by changing her, but by refusing to accept the world's judgment of her as truth. Elena took a deep breath, smoothed down her skirt, and headed out to where Grant was waiting with his wagon to take her and her father into town. James had insisted on going despite his weakness, determined to see his daughter face down the people who'd tormented her for so long. Grant's expression when he saw her made Elena's breath catch. He looked at her like she was something precious, something beautiful, and for the first time in her life, Elena almost believed it might be true. "You look lovely," he said simply, offering his hand to help her into the wagon. "It's just a dress," Elena said, but her voice was breathless. "It's not the dress." Grant's eyes held hers. "It's you." The ride into town was quiet, tension building with every mile. Elena's hands were clenched in her lap, her stomach churning with anxiety. Grant seemed to sense her nervousness because he reached over and gently covered her hand with his. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "We can turn around right now." "No." Elena forced strength into her voice. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of letting them make me feel small. If I'm going to stay in this town, I need to stop living in fear of them." "That's my girl," James said from the back of the wagon, pride clear in his weak voice. The town hall was already crowded when they arrived, music spilling out into the street. Elena could see people gathered in clusters, laughing and talking. The whole town turned out for the monthly social that served as Coldwater Springs' primary entertainment. Grant helped Elena down from the wagon, then supported James on his other side. Together, the three of them walked toward the entrance, and Elena felt like she was walking toward a firing squad. The moment they entered, conversation died. Every eye in the room turned toward them, and Elena felt the familiar wave of judgment wash over her. But this time, she wasn't alone. Grant stood beside her, his presence solid and unwavering. His ranch hands, Carlos, Ben, and Thomas, were near the refreshment table and immediately moved toward them, creating a protective circle. "Miss Cross," Carlos said warmly, as if they were at the orchard rather than in the lion's den, "you look wonderful this evening." "Thank you, Carlos," Elena managed, her voice surprisingly steady. Mrs. Patricia Thornberry was the first to approach, her daughter Melissa in tow. Their expressions were complex mixtures of curiosity and disdain. "Why, Miss Cross?" Mrs. Thornberry said, her voice dripping false sweetness. "What a surprise to see you here, and with Mr. Mercer. How unexpected." "Good evening, Mrs. Thornberry." Elena kept her voice neutral. "Miss Thornberry." Melissa looked Elena up and down, her eyes calculating. "That's a new dress. Did you make it yourself?" "I did," Elena said, refusing to be ashamed. "How resourceful." Melissa's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Though I suppose when one can't fit into store-bought dresses, one must improvise." Grant's hand tightened on Elena's arm, and when he spoke, his voice was cold as winter ice. "Miss Thornberry, that dress is better made than anything I've seen in this town. Miss Cross has considerable skill as a seamstress, in addition to her many other talents. Perhaps instead of making catty remarks, you might try learning something useful yourself." Melissa's face flushed red. Her mother opened her mouth to respond, but Grant had already turned away, dismissing them as beneath his notice. "Would you like to dance?" he asked Elena, his voice warm again. Elena's stomach dropped. I don't dance." "Why not?" "Because She couldn't say it, couldn't voice all the reasons, because she was too heavy, too awkward, because people would laugh, because she'd never been asked before and didn't know how. "Because you've never had a partner who deserved you," Grant finished for her. He held out his hand. "Dance with me, Elena. Show them you're not afraid." Elena looked at his outstretched hand, then at the crowd watching them with barely concealed anticipation. They wanted her to fail, wanted her to stumble and make a fool of herself, wanted confirmation that she was everything they'd always said she was. She thought of her father, sitting in a chair by the wall, watching her with such hope in his eyes. She thought of the last 6 weeks, of being treated with respect and kindness, of learning that maybe the world's judgment wasn't the final word on her worth. She thought of Grant standing there with his hand extended, offering not pity, but partnership. Elena took his hand. The crowd parted as they walked to the center of the floor, whispers following them like a wake. The musicians, sensing drama, struck up a waltz. Grant pulled Elena into dance position, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. "I don't know the steps," Elena whispered, panicked. "Then follow my lead," Grant said calmly. "I've got you." He did. Grant guided her through the steps with patient confidence, and Elena found that her body, so often criticized for taking up too much space, actually knew how to move with grace when given the chance. She stumbled once, but Grant caught her easily, turning it into part of the dance. Around them, other couples began to join in, but Elena barely noticed. She was lost in the moment, in the feeling of being held, of moving in harmony with another person, of being seen not as a burden, but as a partner. "You're doing beautifully," Grant murmured, and Elena realized with a start that he was right. She was dancing, actually dancing, and it felt wonderful. When the music ended, applause rippled through the crowd, polite, uncertain applause that came more from social obligation than genuine appreciation. But Elena didn't care. She'd done it. She'd faced them down and proved she could exist in their space without crumbling. Grant led her off the floor, and they'd barely reached the refreshment table when Mayor Walsh approached with his wife Margaret in tow. The mayor was a portly man with a politician's smile and a businessman's calculating eyes. "Mr. Mercer," he said jovially, extending his hand, "good to see you joining our little social gathering. And Miss Cross, how nice of you to attend." "Mayor, Mrs. Walsh." Grant's tone was polite but cool. "I wanted to speak with you about the Territorial Development Committee," Mayor Walsh continued, clearly more interested in Grant than Elena. "We're looking for prominent landowners to—" "If you'll excuse me, Mayor, I'm in the middle of a conversation," Grant interrupted smoothly. He turned to Elena, his attention completely focused on her. You were telling me about your plans for the spring planting. Elena blinked, surprised. I. Yes. I'm thinking of adding some cherry trees to the south section. Cherry trees. Grant's interest was genuine. What variety? As they discussed cultivation, the mayor and his wife were left standing awkwardly nearby, dismissed. It was a small thing, but the message was clear. Grant valued Elena's conversation over the mayor's political maneuvering. Margaret Walsh's face pinched with displeasure. Really, Mr. Mercer, I understand you've been spending time at the Cross Orchard, but surely you don't need to be quite so public about it. Grant turned to her slowly, his expression dangerous. I'm sorry, Mrs. Walsh. I don't believe I understand your meaning. I'm simply saying, Margaret pressed on, oblivious to the warning in his tone, that a man of your standing associating so closely with someone of Miss Cross's, well, her reputation might suffer from... Her reputation? Grant's voice cut through the noise of the hall like a blade. Miss Cross's reputation is that of a hard-working, intelligent, capable woman who survived more cruelty and hardship than most people in this room could imagine. If associating with her damages my standing, then I'm proud to take the hit. The room had gone quiet again, everyone straining to hear. Now see here, Mayor Walsh blustered. My wife only meant... I know exactly what your wife meant. Grant took a step forward, and his presence seemed to fill the entire space. And I'm telling you, telling all of you, his gaze swept the room, that Elena Cross is worth 10 of anyone here. She's smarter, stronger, more resilient, and more genuinely good than the lot of you combined. Elena felt her face burning, torn between mortification and something that felt dangerously like joy. She spent her life being judged by people who wouldn't last a day doing the work she does, Grant continued, his voice ringing with conviction. People who measure worth in inches and pounds instead of character and courage. Well, I'm done watching it. We're all done watching it. His ranch hands moved closer, a show of solidarity. Carlos nodded firmly. Ben crossed his arms, his expression making it clear where he stood. Thomas smiled at Elena encouragingly. From now on, Grant said, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity, Elena Cross will be treated with the respect she deserves in this town. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me. The silence was absolute. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could feel every eye on her, but this time the stares felt different, uncertain, confused, as if Grant's words had somehow shifted the foundation of something everyone had accepted as truth. Then Grant did something that made Elena's breath stop entirely. He turned to her, took both her hands in his, and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Elena, I need to say something, and I need to say it publicly, because I want everyone here to witness it. Grant, what are you... Elena started, but he squeezed her hands gently, asking her to trust him. I've spent 6 weeks getting to know you, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. 6 weeks learning from you, working beside you, talking with you. And in that time, I've come to realize something important. Elena's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. I've fallen in love with you, Grant said simply, with your strength and your intelligence and your kindness, with the way you care for your father and your orchard and everything you touch, with the grace you show to people who don't deserve it, with the courage it takes to keep going despite everything this world has thrown at you. Elena felt tears streaming down her face, unable to stop them. Grant, I know this is sudden, he continued. I know you might not feel the same way, but I needed you to know, needed everyone here to know. I love you, Elena Cross, and I'm proud to say it in front of anyone who wants to listen. The room erupted. Some people gasped. Others whispered frantically to their neighbors. Mrs. Thornberry looked like she might faint. Melissa's mouth hung open in shock. Mayor and Mrs. Walsh seemed frozen in place, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. But Elena barely noticed any of it. She was staring at Grant, at this incredible, impossible man who'd just declared his love for her in front of the entire town. The man who'd seen past everything the world said she was and found something worth loving underneath. Say something, Grant said softly, and Elena could hear the vulnerability beneath his confidence. Please. Elena opened her mouth, but no words came. How could she express what she was feeling? How could she possibly articulate the hope and fear and desperate, overwhelming love that was flooding through her? So she didn't try to speak. Instead, she stood on her toes. Grant was so much taller, and and kissed him. It was brief, chaste, entirely inappropriate for a public gathering. It was also the bravest thing Elena had ever done in her life. When she pulled back, Grant was smiling, the biggest, most genuine smile she'd ever seen on his face. "I love you too," Elena whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. "I've been trying so hard not to, but I do. I love you." Grant pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Elena buried her face in his chest, feeling his heartbeat against her cheek. Around them, the crowd was in an uproar, but in that moment, none of it mattered. Nothing mattered except this: being held, being loved, being seen for exactly who she was. When they finally pulled apart, James was making his way toward them, leaning heavily on his cane, but with tears of joy streaming down his weathered face. "Papa," Elena said, rushing to support him. "My girl," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "My brave, beautiful girl. I'm so proud of you." "Mr. Cross," Grant said formally, "I would like to ask your permission to court your daughter, with the intention of asking for her hand in marriage when the time is right." James laughed, the sound wet with tears. "Son, I think you're a bit past the courting stage at this point. But yes, you have my blessing. You have my gratitude. You have my respect for seeing what I've always known, that my Elena is the finest woman in this territory or any other." Grant shook James's hand solemnly, then turned back to Elena. "Ready to face the aftermath?" Elena looked around the room at the shocked faces, the whispered conversations, the society that had tormented her for so long, now forced to reconcile their prejudices with the reality standing before them. She thought about how terrified she'd been walking in here, how convinced she was that nothing would ever change. But everything had changed. Not her body, not her appearance, not any of the external things the world had told her mattered. What had changed was her understanding of her own worth. Grant hadn't given her value. He'd simply helped her recognize the value that had been there all along. "I'm ready," Elena said, taking Grant's hand. "Let them talk. Let them judge. I don't care anymore." And in that moment, surrounded by the people who'd made her life miserable for so long, Elena Cross realized something profound. Their opinions didn't define her. Their cruelty couldn't touch her, because she'd found something more powerful than their judgment. She'd found people who saw her clearly, loved her truly, and stood with her proudly. She'd found her own strength, reflected back to her through Grant's eyes and her father's pride, and her own hard-won understanding that she had always been enough, exactly as she was. The woman they'd laughed at, the target of their mockery and scorn, was no longer hiding. She was standing in the center of the room, loved and loving, finally free from the prison their words had built around her. And that freedom, Elena realized, was worth more than all their acceptance ever could be. The ride back to the orchard that night was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the tense silence of the journey into town. Elena sat between Grant and her father on the wagon bench, her hand clasped firmly in Grant's, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "That was quite a declaration," James said finally, a smile in his voice. "You don't do anything by halves, do you, son?" Grant glanced at Elena, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "When something matters, it deserves to be said clearly. No room for doubt or misinterpretation." "No room indeed," James chuckled, then coughed, a wet, rattling sound that reminded them all too sharply of his failing health. "Half the town probably thinks you've lost your mind." "Let them think what they want," Grant said firmly. "I know what I know." Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, still processing everything that had happened. Grant had declared his love for her in front of everyone. He'd kissed her in the middle of the town hall. He'd made it impossible for anyone to dismiss their relationship as mere friendship or charitable assistance. He'd claimed her, publicly and irrevocably. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a warmth that spread from her chest to her fingertips. When they reached the orchard, Grant helped James down from the wagon with careful gentleness. The older man was exhausted, the evening's excitement having drained what little strength he had left. "I'll see him inside, Elena said, supporting her father's weight. "I'll tend the horse," Grant replied. "Then I'd like to talk to you, if you're not too tired." Elena's heart skipped. "I'll meet you on the porch." She helped her father to his bed, removing his boots and covering him with the worn quilt her mother had made years before. James caught her hand as she turned to leave. "Elena, wait!" She sat on the edge of the bed. What is it, Papa? James's eyes were serious in the lamplight. That man loves you, really loves you. You know that, don't you? I'm beginning to believe it, Elena whispered. Good, because I need you to understand something. James's grip tightened. My time is short. We both know it. The doctor says weeks, maybe a month at most, and I need to know you'll be taken care of when I'm gone. Papa, don't listen to me. His voice was gentle but insistent. Grant Mercer is a good man, the kind of man I'd hoped would find you but never dared believe actually existed. He sees you the way I see you, clearly, completely, without all the poison this world has tried to make you swallow. Tears pricked Elena's eyes. I know. Then don't let fear keep you from happiness. Don't punish yourself for daring to be loved. James pulled her hand to his chest. Promise me, Elena. Promise me you'll marry him, that you'll let yourself have the life you deserve. He hasn't asked me yet, Elena said, trying to lighten the moment despite the heaviness in her chest. He will. James's certainty was absolute, and when he does, I want to be there. I want to see my daughter marry a man who loves her before I leave this world. Elena wiped her eyes. Then you'll be there, Papa. I promise. Good. James settled back into his pillows. His breathing labored. Now go. He's waiting for you, and you've made him wait long enough. Elena kissed her father's forehead, then stepped out into the night. Grant was sitting on the porch steps, his hat beside him, looking out at the orchard bathed in moonlight. How is he, Tet? Grant asked as Elena sat down next to him. Tired. Happy. Elena paused. Dying. Grant's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close. I'm sorry. He wants to see us married, Elena said quietly. Before he goes. Then we'll marry. Grant said it simply, like it was the most natural thing in the world. If you'll have me. Elena turned to look at him, searching his face in the dim light. Grant, are you sure about this? Really sure? Because once we're married, there's no taking it back. You'll be tied to me, to whatever judgment comes with loving someone the world sees as less than. Grant cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. Elena Cross, you are not less than anyone, and I'm not sure about many things in this life, but I'm absolutely certain about you, about us. How can you be so sure? Elena's voice cracked. We've only known each other a few months. I've known you long enough to see who you are when you think no one's watching, Grant said. I've seen you work until your hands bleed to save a sick tree. I've watched you care for your father with endless patience and tenderness. I've heard the way you talk about this land, about the future, about everything you've built and everything you hope to build. He leaned his forehead against hers. I've seen your strength, your courage, your grace under pressure. I've seen the way you refuse to become bitter despite everything this world has thrown at you. And Elena, I want to spend the rest of my life being worthy of you. You already are, Elena whispered. Then marry me. Grant pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. Not because your father wants it, not because it's practical or convenient. Marry me because you love me and I love you and we're better together than apart. Elena thought about all the reasons she should say no, about the scandal it would cause, the gossip, the judgment, about how people would whisper that Grant had been trapped or made a terrible mistake, about how she'd spend the rest of her life watching for the moment when he realized what everyone else had always known, that she wasn't enough. But then she thought about the last few months, about how Grant had never once looked at her with anything but respect and admiration, about how he'd defended her, supported her, loved her without reservation or condition, about how he'd helped her see herself differently, not by changing who she was, but by refusing to accept the world's lies about her worth. She thought about her father's words. Don't let fear keep you from living. Yes, Elena said, the word trembling but certain. Yes, I'll marry you. Grant's smile was like sunrise, bright and warm and full of promise. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Elena felt something settle deep in her chest, a sense of rightness, of coming home to a place she'd never known existed. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Grant said, I want to do this right, traditional. I want to ask your father properly, get his official blessing. He'll say yes, Elena said, smiling through fresh tears. I know. but he deserves the respect of being asked. Grant stood, pulling Elena to her feet. Tomorrow morning, first thing. But tomorrow morning came differently than they expected. Elena woke to silence, the wrong kind of silence. She was out of bed and running to her father's room before conscious thought caught up with instinct, her heart already knowing what her mind refused to accept. James Cross lay still in his bed, his face peaceful, his chest unmoving. "Papa?" Elena's voice was small, childlike. "Papa, wake up!" But he didn't wake up. He was gone, slipped away sometime in the night while Elena slept. His suffering finally ended. Elena sank to her knees beside the bed, taking his cold hand in hers. She'd known this was coming, had known for months that every day with him was borrowed time, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. Didn't fill the sudden gaping void in her chest where her father's love had always lived. She didn't know how long she knelt there before she heard hoofbeats outside. Grant must have arrived for his usual morning visit. She should go tell him, should do something, but she couldn't seem to make her body move. Then Grant was there, kneeling beside her, his arm around her shaking shoulders. "Elena," he said softly, "I'm so sorry." "He was fine last night," Elena said numbly. "We talked. He smiled. He was happy. And now he's just gone." "I know." Grant held her close, letting her lean into his strength. "I know." The next few days passed in a blur of necessary tasks. The doctor came to confirm what Elena already knew. The undertaker arrived to prepare the body. Grant handled most of the arrangements, shielding Elena from the worst of it while she tried to process a grief too large to fit inside her chest. The funeral was small, just Elena, Grant, his ranch hands, and a handful of townspeople who'd respected James Cross even if they'd scorned his daughter. They buried him on the hillside overlooking the orchard, under the apple trees he'd planted 30 years ago, when he'd first staked his claim to this land. Elena stood at the graveside, Grant's hand firm in hers, and said goodbye to the man who'd loved her unconditionally her entire life. The man who'd taught her to see value in herself, even when the world said she had none. The man who'd given her roots and wings in equal measure. "He was proud of you," Grant said quietly, as the last mourners drifted away. "He told me so, that first day I met him. Said you were his greatest achievement." "I didn't deserve him," Elena whispered. "Yes, you did." Grant turned her to face him, and he knew you deserved more than this town ever gave you. That's why he was so happy about us. About knowing you'd be loved the way you should be. Elena nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Come back to the house," Grant said gently. "You shouldn't be alone right now." But when they returned to the cabin, they found they weren't alone. Carlos, Ben, and Thomas were there, along with several of Grant's other ranch hands. They'd prepared food, straightened the house, and were clearly planning to stay until Elena was ready to be by herself. "We thought you might need some help," Carlos said simply. "Mr. Cross was a good man. We wanted to pay our respects." The kindness undid something in Elena. She sat at her father's table, surrounded by these men who'd become friends, and finally let herself cry. They didn't try to stop her or tell her to be strong. They just sat with her, their presence a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone, that grief didn't have to be carried in isolation. As evening fell and the ranch hands finally left, Grant showed no signs of leaving with them. "You don't have to stay," Elena said, though part of her desperately hoped he would. "I'm not leaving you alone tonight," Grant said firmly. "I'll sleep on the porch if it's not proper for me to stay inside, but I'm not going back to the ranch." "Stay inside," Elena said quietly. "Please. I don't want to be alone." So Grant stayed. He slept in the chair by the cold fireplace while Elena tossed restlessly in her bed, and when she woke from nightmares in the early hours of the morning, he was there, solid, steady, real. The weeks that followed were hard. Elena threw herself into work preparing the orchard for harvest, trying to outrun the grief that dogged her steps. Grant came every day, helping with the heavy labor, making sure she ate, forcing her to rest when she pushed herself too hard. "You're going to make yourself sick," he said one evening, finding her still working long after sunset. "I need to keep busy," Elena said, her hands moving mechanically through the task of checking irrigation lines. "If I stop, I'll think. And if I think, you'll feel," Grant finished. "Elena, you can't run from grief. It'll catch up eventually. I know, Elena's voice broke. But right now, running is all I can manage. Grant pulled her into his arms, and Elena let herself collapse against him, borrowing his strength when her own had run dry. The harvest is in 3 weeks, she said against his chest. Papa wanted to see one more harvest. He talked about it all the time, about how this year's crop was going to be the best we'd ever had. Then we'll make it the best harvest this orchard has ever seen, Grant said. For him? And for you. Elena pulled back to look at him. You don't have to keep helping me. I know you have your own ranch to run. The ranch is fine. Carlos can manage for a few more weeks. Grant cupped her face. Elena, I made you a promise. I said I'd be here. I meant it. Even though Papa's gone? The question came out small, vulnerable. Even though there's no one left to see you keep your word? Grant's expression turned fierce. I see. That's what matters. And Elena, I didn't ask you to marry me because of your father. I asked because I love you. That hasn't changed. Elena searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or regret, but all she saw was steady certainty and a love so clear it made her chest ache. I'm scared, she admitted. Papa was the only person who ever believed I was worth something. Now that he's gone, I'm terrified I'll wake up one day and you'll realize he was wrong. That everyone else was right about me all along. That's not going to happen, Grant's voice was absolute. Because I see you, Elena. Not through your father's eyes or the town's eyes or anyone else's, through my own. And what I see is the woman I want to spend my life with. Even though Stop. Grant pressed a finger gently to her lips. Don't finish that sentence. Don't give voice to their poison. You're not too much or not enough or any of the other lies they've tried to make you believe. You're exactly right. Exactly perfect. Exactly mine, if you will have me. Elena closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. Slowly, painfully, she was beginning to understand what her father and Grant had both tried to show her, that her worth wasn't determined by other people's judgment, that she had the right to take up space, to be loved, to claim happiness without apology. I'll have you, she whispered. But Grant, we need to wait. For the harvest. For a proper mourning period. I can't think about a wedding right now. We'll wait as long as you need, Grant said. But Elena, I want you to know something. Your father's last words to me, that night at the social, were about the orchard. Elena's breath caught. What did he say? He said that this land was his legacy, but you were his heart. He said that if we married, the orchard should stay in your name, that you'd earned it with your blood and sweat and tears, and no man, not even one he trusted, should take that away from you. Tears spilled down Elena's cheeks. That sounded exactly like something her father would say. He made me promise, Grant continued, that when we married, I'd sign papers making it clear that this orchard was yours and yours alone, that my role would be as your partner, not your owner. Elena had never heard of such an arrangement. In 1882, when a woman married, everything she owned became her husband's property. That was simply how the law worked. How would we even do that, she asked. I've spoken to a lawyer in the territorial capital. There are ways, trusts, legal agreements. It won't be simple, but it's possible. Grant smiled slightly. Your father was very insistent. He said you'd built something here, something that belonged to you, and he'd be damned if marriage meant you lost your independence. Fresh grief and love warred in Elena's chest. Her father had thought of everything, had protected her even in death. He really said that? Every word. Grant pulled her close again. He loved you so much, Elena, and he trusted me to love you the same way, as an equal, a partner, someone worthy of respect and autonomy. Elena cried then, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere beyond grief, beyond loss, beyond anything she could name. She cried for her father, for the years of judgment she'd endured, for the girl she'd been who'd believed all the cruel things people said about her, and she cried with relief, with gratitude, with the overwhelming realization that she'd been given something precious, people who saw her worth when she couldn't see it herself. Grant held her through it all, steady as stone, his arms a safe harbor in the storm of her emotions. When the tears finally subsided, Elena felt hollowed out, but also somehow lighter, as if crying had released something she'd been carrying for too long. Tell me about the harvest, Grant said softly. What needs to happen? So Elena did. They sat on the porch in the growing darkness, and she outlined her plans, the picking schedule, the storage requirements, the transport to market. Grant listened carefully, asking questions, offering suggestions, treating her expertise with the respect it deserved. "We'll need at least a dozen workers," Elena said. "Maybe 15 if we want to get everything picked at peak ripeness." "You'll have them," Grant promised. "My whole crew, plus day workers from the ranch." "Good men, Elena. Men who'll work hard and treat you right." "That's too many. I can't afford. We'll work it out." Grant squeezed her hand. "Remember our agreement? Labor for knowledge. You've taught me everything I need to know to start my own orchards. This is my end of the bargain." But Elena knew it was more than that. This was Grant taking care of her, protecting her, making sure her father's last harvest was everything it should be. The 3 weeks until harvest passed in a blur of preparation. Grant was true to his word, bringing his entire crew to help with the final pre-harvest tasks. They repaired equipment, reinforced storage sheds, organized the picking supplies. Carlos, who'd worked fruit harvests in California before coming to cattle country, shared his expertise. Ben and Thomas built additional drying racks for the apples that would be preserved for winter sale. And through it all, the town watched. Elena could feel their eyes on her whenever she went into Coldwater Springs for supplies. The gossip had reached a fever pitch after the social, Grant Mercer, one of the most eligible bachelors in the territory, publicly declaring love for the town's object of ridicule. People didn't know what to make of it. Some said Grant was being charitable, that he felt sorry for her and would come to his senses eventually. Others whispered that he must be after her land, though that made little sense given that he owned far more property than she did. A few suggested he was simply eccentric, a rich man's peculiarity that would fade with time. But mostly, they were confused, because Grant's devotion showed no signs of wavering. He was at the orchard every day, working beside Elena, treating her with obvious affection and respect, and gradually, grudgingly, the town's attitude began to shift. It started small. Mrs. Henderson at the general store began greeting Elena politely instead of with barely concealed disdain. Tom Bradley, the ranch hand who'd mocked her so cruelly months ago, tipped his hat when they passed on the street. Melissa Thornberry, who'd joined her mother in tormenting Elena, actually smiled and wished her good morning. The change wasn't complete. There were still whispers, still judgmental stares. But something fundamental had shifted. Grant Mercer's public claim had forced the town to reconsider its assumptions. If a man like Grant could see value in Elena Cross, maybe, just maybe, they'd been wrong about her. Elena didn't particularly care whether they'd changed their minds. Their belated acceptance felt hollow, built on the foundation of a man's approval rather than genuine recognition of her worth. But she had to admit it made life easier. The hostility that had followed her for years had diminished to mere curiosity. The harvest began on a crisp September morning with 15 workers assembled in the orchard and Elena standing before them giving instructions. A year ago, she would have been terrified to command this kind of attention, but months of working with Grant's crew had given her confidence in her own authority. "The red apples in the east section are ready first," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Pick carefully. Bruised fruit won't store well. Carlos will show you the technique if you're not familiar. Questions?" There were a few, which Elena answered competently. Then the workers dispersed to their assigned sections, and the real work began. Elena worked alongside them, picking and sorting with the efficiency of long practice. Grant stayed close, following her lead, asking questions when he wasn't sure about something. The other workers took their cue from him. If the boss was willing to defer to Elena's expertise, so would they. By midday, they'd filled a dozen crates with perfect apples. Elena stood looking at them, her heart full of bittersweet emotion. Her father should be here, should be seeing this, his final harvest brought in by a crew of willing workers instead of Elena struggling alone. Grant appeared at her elbow, as if he'd sensed her thoughts. "He'd be proud," he said quietly. "I know." Elena wiped her eyes. "I just wish he could see it." "Maybe he can." Grant looked up at the hillside where James was buried, visible from the orchard. "Maybe he's watching right now, seeing his daughter run the finest harvest this orchard has ever known." Elena wanted to believe that, wanted to think her father's spirit was somehow present, witnessing her success, knowing she'd be all right. The harvest took 2 weeks of hard work. Every day the workers arrived at dawn and stayed until dusk, picking and sorting and packing. Elena moved among them, inspecting quality, answering questions, solving problems as they arose. She was in her element, and everyone could see it. On the final day, when the last apple had been picked and stored, Elena stood in the orchard and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. They'd done it. The harvest was complete, the yield was excellent, and every worker had been paid fairly and treated well. "You did it," Grant said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Your father's legacy is secure." Elena leaned back against him, exhausted but satisfied. "We did it. I couldn't have managed without you." "That's what partners do," Grant said. "They support each other." Partners. Not owner and property. Not husband and subordinate wife. Partners. Elena turned in his arms to face him. "Grant, I want to marry you. Not in 6 months or a year when mourning period is over. Soon. Now. While I still feel like this, strong and capable and worthy." Grant's eyes searched hers. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Elena's voice was steady. "Papa wanted to see us married. He didn't get that. But he'd want me to be happy, to move forward with my life. And Grant, you make me happy. You make me believe I deserve to be happy." "You do deserve it," Grant said fiercely. "And Elena, if you'll marry me tomorrow, I'll be the happiest man alive." "Tomorrow might be too soon," Elena said with a slight smile. "But soon. Before winter. Under the orchard trees where Papa can see us from his hillside." "Under the orchard trees," Grant agreed, "with everyone we care about as witnesses." They set the date for October 15th, 6 weeks after James's death. Not the full mourning period tradition demanded, but long enough to be respectful. The wedding would be simple, held at the orchard instead of in town, with Grant's ranch hands and a handful of Elena's neighbors as guests. The night before the wedding, Elena sat on her porch, looking out at the orchard bathed in moonlight. Tomorrow she would become Elena Mercer. Tomorrow she would bind her life to Grant's in front of witnesses, making permanent what her heart had already accepted as true. She heard footsteps on the path and looked up to find Grant approaching, though he was supposed to be at his ranch observing the tradition of not seeing the bride before the wedding. "Couldn't stay away," he said sheepishly. "I know it's bad luck, but I needed to see you." "I'm glad you came." Elena made room for him on the step. "I was just thinking about tomorrow." "Having second thoughts?" "Not even first ones." Elena took his hand. "I was thinking about how different my life is now compared to 6 months ago. How different I am." "You're not different," Grant said. "You're just finally seeing yourself clearly." "Because you helped me see." Elena squeezed his hand. "Grant, I need you to know something. I'm marrying you because I love you. Not because I'm grateful. Not because you saved me. Not because I need someone to take care of me. Because I genuinely, completely love you." "I know that." Grant brought her hand to his lips. "And I love you the same way. Not because I feel sorry for you or because I want to fix you. Because you're brilliant and strong and beautiful, and spending my life with you is the greatest honor I can imagine." They sat in comfortable silence, hand in hand, until the moon was high overhead. Then Grant kissed her goodnight and headed back to his ranch, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts and her orchard and the future spreading out before her like the branches of her apple trees, full of promise, rooted deep, reaching toward the light. The morning of October 15th dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Elena woke early, as always, but this time the flutter in her stomach had nothing to do with anxiety or dread. Today she was getting married. She stood at her bedroom window looking out at the orchard, where Grant's ranch hands were already setting up chairs and tables for the ceremony and celebration afterward. Carlos was directing the operation with his usual efficiency, while Ben and Thomas hung lanterns from the apple tree branches that would illuminate the evening festivities. Elena had chosen to marry under the oldest tree in the orchard, the one her father had planted when he'd first claimed this land 30 years ago. From there, you could see his grave on the hillside, a silent witness to his daughter's happiness. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Mrs. Sarah Mitchell standing on the porch, a dress bag draped over her arm. Sarah was one of the few neighbors who'd always treated Elena with basic human decency, though they'd never been particularly close. "Mrs. Mitchell," Elena said, surprised. "I wasn't expecting you until this afternoon." I know, dear, but I thought you might need help getting ready. Sarah's smile was warm and genuine. A bride shouldn't have to dress herself on her wedding day. Elena felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. Her mother had died when she was young, and her father, bless him, had never been equipped to help with things like hair and dresses. She'd grown accustomed to managing on her own, to not expecting the small kindnesses other women took for granted. That's very kind of you, Elena said, stepping aside to let Sarah enter. Nonsense. It's my pleasure. Sarah hung the dress bag carefully on the bedroom door. Now, let's see what we're working with. Elena had made her wedding dress herself, working late into the night for the past 3 weeks. It was simple but beautiful. Cream-colored cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, fitted at the bodice but with a full skirt that moved gracefully when she walked. She'd designed it specifically for her body, refusing to hide or minimize, instead creating something that honored her shape rather than fought against it. Sarah helped her into the dress, lacing up the back with practiced fingers. This is exquisite work, Elena. You have real talent. Thank you. Elena smoothed her hands down the skirt, marveling at how the dress made her feel. Not diminished or apologetic, but beautiful, worthy, ready to walk down the aisle toward a man who loved her exactly as she was. Now for your hair, Sarah said, producing combs and pins from her bag. I was thinking we could braid it and pin it up, maybe leave a few curls loose to frame your face. For the next hour, Sarah worked her magic, transforming Elena's usually practical hairstyle into something soft and romantic. She wove small white flowers from the orchard into the braids and stepped back to survey her handiwork. Perfect, Sarah declared. Elena, you look absolutely lovely. Elena turned to the small mirror on her dresser and barely recognized herself. The woman looking back at her was radiant, glowing with happiness and anticipation. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright, her smile genuine and unguarded. I do look lovely, Elena said, the admission feeling bold and true. I really do. You always have, dear, Sarah said gently. Some of us were just too foolish to see it. Elena turned to look at her neighbor, surprised by the admission. Sarah met her gaze steadily. I owe you an apology, Elena. I never joined in the cruelty, but I never stopped it either. I stood by and let them tear you down, and I'm ashamed of that. You deserved better. You've always deserved better. You're here now, Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. That's what matters. Grant Mercer is a lucky man, Sarah continued, and I hope you'll be very happy together. A commotion outside drew their attention to the window. More guests were arriving, ranch hands from neighboring properties, a few townspeople, even the Hendersons from the general store. Elena watched them gather under the apple trees, watched Carlos directing them to seats, watched the orchard she'd built with her own hands transform into a wedding venue. It's almost time, Sarah said. Are you ready? Elena took a deep breath, her hand going instinctively to the locket around her neck, the one that held a small photograph of her father. I'm ready. They walked outside together, Sarah supporting Elena's elbow as they navigated the uneven ground. The guests were all seated, facing the old apple tree where Grant stood waiting with the territorial judge who would perform the ceremony. But it was Grant's expression when he saw Elena that made her breath catch. He looked at her like she was the most precious thing he'd ever seen, like he couldn't quite believe his good fortune, like she was everything he'd ever wanted and more than he'd dared hope for. Elena walked toward him, her steps steady and sure, her head held high. She passed rows of guests, some friendly, some merely curious, a few still openly skeptical. She saw Mrs. Thornberry sitting stiffly beside her daughter Melissa, both of them watching with expressions Elena couldn't quite read. She saw Mayor Walsh and his wife Margaret, the same people who'd witnessed Grant's public declaration at the social. But mostly, she saw Grant, and the love in his eyes was so clear, so absolute, that everything else faded into insignificance. When she reached him, Grant took her hands in his grip warm and strong. You're beautiful, he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. So are you, Elena whispered back, making him smile. The judge cleared his throat and began the ceremony. Elena barely heard the traditional words, too focused on Grant's face, on the way his thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands, on the certainty radiating from him that this was right, that they were right. Do you, Grant Mercer, take Elena Cross to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? I do. Grant's voice rang out clear and strong, leaving no room for doubt. And do you, Elena Cross, take Grant Mercer to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? Elena looked into Grant's eyes and saw her future there, a future built on partnership and respect, on love that saw her clearly and chose her anyway, on the radical notion that she was worthy exactly as she was. I do, she said, her voice steady and sure. Then by the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The judge smiled. You may kiss your bride. Grant cupped Elena's face in his hands and kissed her softly, sweetly, a promise sealed in front of everyone who doubted them. When they pulled apart, the gathered crowd erupted in applause, genuine applause, not the polite, uncertain clapping from the social. They turned to face their guests as husband and wife, and Elena felt a surge of triumph so powerful it nearly took her breath away. She'd done it. She'd claimed her happiness despite everything the world had tried to make her believe about herself. She'd looked fear and judgment in the face and chosen love anyway. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Coldwater Springs had seen in years. Tables groaned under the weight of food, roasted meats, fresh bread, vegetables from neighboring farms, and apple pies made from the orchard's harvest. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon music filled the air as couples took to the makeshift dance floor. Grant led Elena in the first dance just as he had at the social months ago. But this time, Elena moved with confidence, no longer worried about stumbling or making a fool of herself. She trusted Grant to lead, trusted herself to follow, trusted that even if she did stumble, he'd catch her. Happy? Grant murmured as they spun beneath the apple trees. Happier than I ever thought possible, Elena admitted. When the dance ended, other guests approached to offer congratulations. Carlos shook Grant's hand and kissed Elena's cheek. Congratulations, Mrs. Mercer. You two are going to be very happy together. Mrs. Mercer. The name felt strange but wonderful on Elena's tongue. Ben and Thomas presented them with a hand-carved wooden sign for the orchard. Mercer Orchards, it read, though Elena had insisted on keeping Cross in smaller letters beneath it. This land was her father's legacy, and she wouldn't erase that. Even some of the townspeople who'd been cruel to her in the past came forward with tentative congratulations. Mrs. Thornberry actually smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Best wishes for a happy marriage, Miss Cross. Mrs. Mercer, I mean. Thank you, Elena said graciously, though she felt no particular warmth toward the woman who'd tormented her for years. Melissa Thornberry hung back, looking uncomfortable. Finally, as the celebration was winding down, she approached Elena alone. Mrs. Mercer, she said quietly, could I speak with you for a moment? Elena nodded, curious despite herself. Melissa glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then said in a rush, I wanted to apologize for how I treated you. All those cruel things I said, the way I mocked you. It was wrong, inexcusable, and I'm sorry. Elena studied the younger woman's face, searching for signs of insincerity. But Melissa looked genuinely ashamed, her eyes downcast, her hands twisting nervously. Why now? Elena asked. Why apologize today? Because watching you today, watching how happy you are, how confident, how completely unbothered by what anyone thinks, made me realize something. Melissa met Elena's eyes. You were always the strong one. You endured our cruelty with more grace than we showed in giving it, and I was cruel because I was scared. Scared of what? Of being like you, Melissa admitted. Of not fitting the mold, of being judged and found wanting. So I judged you first, tried to tear you down so I'd feel safer, more secure in my own place. But watching you now, I see how small that made me, how small it still makes me. Elena was quiet for a moment, processing this unexpected confession. Then she said, I appreciate the apology, Melissa, truly. But you should know I'm not forgiving you because I'm trying to be noble, or because it's my wedding day and I'm feeling generous. Melissa flinched, but Elena continued. I'm accepting your apology because holding on to anger would only hurt me, not you, because I've learned that my worth isn't determined by how other people treat me. Your cruelty couldn't diminish me, and your apology can't validate me. I validate myself now. Melissa's eyes widened slightly. That's wise. It's survival, Elena corrected. It's choosing to live free from the prison of other people's opinions. I hope someday you'll do the same. Before Melissa could respond, Grant appeared at Elena's elbow. Sorry to interrupt, but we should probably cut the cake before the sun sets completely. Elena excused herself from Melissa and allowed Grant to lead her toward the table where a simple but beautiful wedding cake waited. As they cut the first slice together, Elena looked around at the gathered guests, at the orchard bathed in the golden light of sunset, at the man beside her who'd helped her see herself clearly. This was her life now, her choice, her happiness. The celebration continued well into the evening, lanterns casting warm light as stars emerged overhead. Elena danced until her feet ached, laughed until her sides hurt, accepted congratulations until her cheeks hurt from smiling. And through it all, Grant was there, steady, loving, proud to call her his wife. As midnight approached and the last guests finally departed, Elena and Grant stood together in the orchard, surrounded by the trees she'd tended for so many years. Look, Grant said, pointing toward the hillside where James was buried. Your father had the best view in the house. Elena leaned against her husband, and smiled through happy tears. He did. I hope he enjoyed the show. I'm sure he did. Grant wrapped his arms around her. Ready to start our life together, Mrs. Mercer? I've been ready, Elena said. I just didn't know it until you showed me. They stood there in the quiet darkness, two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd chosen to see clearly when the world insisted on distortion, who'd built something real and lasting on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine love. The years that followed were not without challenges. Building a life together, merging two properties into one thriving enterprise, navigating the complexities of business and marriage and community, none of it was easy. But Elena and Grant faced it all as partners, equals in every way that mattered. True to his word, Grant ensured the orchard remained in Elena's name, protected by legal agreements that guaranteed her autonomy and ownership. When their first child was born, a daughter they named Grace, Elena discovered she could be both a mother and a businesswoman. That one role didn't negate the other. The orchard thrived under their joint management. Elena's cultivation expertise combined with Grant's business acumen created an operation that soon became the most successful in the territory. They expanded gradually, adding more acreage, hiring more workers, developing new techniques that other orchardists came to study and emulate. Elena became known throughout the region not as that fat woman from Coldwater Springs, but as an expert cultivator, a shrewd businesswoman, and a respected member of the community. People sought her advice on everything from soil composition to harvest timing to business negotiation. The woman who'd once been invisible, except as an object of mockery, became impossible to ignore. Not because she'd changed her appearance, but because she'd stopped accepting other people's limitations on her worth. The town's attitude shifted gradually but unmistakably. As Elena's success became undeniable, as her marriage proved not just lasting, but genuinely happy, as her expertise became valuable to other farmers and ranchers, people who'd once scorned her began to seek her favor. It was a strange reversal, watching Mrs. Thornberry go out of her way to be friendly, seeing Mayor Walsh ask her opinion on agricultural policy, having merchants offer her credit and special prices. Elena accepted their changed behavior with grace, but without forgetting who'd stood by her when she had nothing but her father's dying orchard and her own determination. She did business with everyone, treated everyone fairly, but she saved her friendship for those who'd earned it, Sarah Mitchell, who'd helped her dress on her wedding day. Grant's ranch hands, who'd never questioned her authority, the few neighbors who'd shown basic human decency even when it wasn't popular. 5 years after her wedding, Elena stood in the orchard on a crisp October morning, watching her daughter play among the apple trees. Grace was 3 years old, bright and curious, with her father's dark hair and her mother's sharp mind. She was chasing butterflies between the trees, her laughter bright as birdsong. "Mama, look," Grace called out, holding up an apple that had fallen from one of the trees. "Is it ready?" Elena walked over and examined the apple, showing Grace how to check for ripeness. "Not quite, sweetheart. See how it's still a little green here? In another week or two, it'll be perfect. Can I help pick them?" "Of course you can. You're part of this orchard, just like I am, just like your grandfather was." They walked together toward the hillside where James was buried, a routine Elena maintained every few weeks. His grave was well tended, always decorated with fresh flowers from the orchard. Elena had commissioned a proper headstone with an inscription that read, James Cross, beloved father, skilled cultivator, a man who saw clearly. Tell me about Grandpa, Grace said, as she always did when they visited. Elena settled onto the grass, pulling her daughter into her lap. Your grandfather was one of the strongest people I ever knew. He worked this land for 30 years, built it from nothing into something beautiful. And more importantly, he taught me to see my own worth when the world tried to convince me I had none. Why would the world do that? Elena smiled at her daughter's innocence. Grace was growing up in a different world than Elena had. A world where her mother was respected and successful, where she'd never know what it felt like to be judged solely on appearance. Sometimes people are scared of things that are different, Elena explained carefully. And when they're scared, they can be cruel. But your grandfather taught me that other people's cruelty says more about them than it does about me. That's what you and Papa always say, Grace said, that people's opinions can't hurt us unless we let them. That's right, sweetheart. Elena hugged her daughter close. And I hope you never forget it. They sat together in the warm sunshine, 3 generations connected by this land. James, who'd planted the first seeds, Elena, who'd nurtured them into thriving business, and Grace, who would inherit not just the orchard, but the lessons of strength and worth that came with it. Grant found them there an hour later, his approach announced by the sound of hoofbeats. He'd been checking the western property line where they were planning to expand next spring. There are my favorite girls, he said, dismounting and settling onto the grass beside them. Grace immediately launched into an excited description of the butterflies she'd seen, and Grant listened with the same focused attention he'd always shown Elena. The attention that said, this person matters. What they're saying matters. They deserve to be heard. Watching him with their daughter, Elena felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it made her chest tight. This was the life she'd built, not in spite of who she was, but because of it. Because she'd refused to accept the world's judgment as final. Because she'd had the courage to believe that love and respect and partnership were possible for her, too. What are you thinking about? Grant asked, catching her expression. How different my life could have been, Elena said honestly. If I'd believed what they said about me. If I'd let their cruelty define my worth. If I'd never met you. But you did meet me, Grant said, taking her hand. And even if you hadn't, I think you would have found your strength eventually. I just helped you see what was already there. Maybe. Elena squeezed his hand. But I'm glad I didn't have to do it alone. That evening, after Grace was in bed, Elena and Grant sat on their porch, the same porch where they'd first talked about partnership and respect, where Grant had first offered to help with the harvest, where so much of their relationship had unfolded in quiet conversations under the stars. I've been thinking, Grant said, about expanding into pairs more seriously. There's a market for them, and the southern section of the property is perfect for it. I've been thinking the same thing, Elena said. We'd need to invest in new stock, maybe hire another specialist worker who knows pairs specifically. They talked business for a while, equals in planning and decision-making, neither one deferring to the other, but instead building strategy together through discussion and debate. This was their pattern, mutual respect, shared authority, genuine partnership in every aspect of their lives. Do you ever regret it? Elena asked suddenly. Tying yourself to me, the judgment that came with it, the way it complicated your standing in the community? Grant turned to look at her, his expression serious. Elena, I'm going to say this as clearly as I can, and I need you to really hear it. Marrying you was the best decision I've ever made. Not because you've been successful, not because the orchard is profitable, not because the town eventually came around. Because you're you. Because every day with you is better than any day without you. Because loving you has made me a better man. You were already a good man, Elena protested. Maybe, but you made me a man who understands the difference between seeing and really seeing. Between accepting someone and truly valuing them. Between pity and respect. Grant took both her hands. You transformed my understanding of what strength looks like, what courage means, what love requires. If that came with some judgment from narrow-minded people, it was worth it 10,000 times over. Elena felt tears slide down her cheeks. Happy tears, grateful tears, tears that came from a place of fullness rather than emptiness. I love you, she said simply. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for letting me, Grant replied, pulling her close. They sat together in the darkness, the orchard rustling around them, the stars bright overhead. And Elena thought about the girl she'd been, frightened, wounded, convinced of her own worthlessness. That girl had survived years of cruelty, had endured judgment and mockery and casual devastation, had built something beautiful despite everyone telling her she couldn't. That girl had grown into a woman who knew her worth, who ran a successful business, who raised a daughter with confidence and love, who'd built a marriage based on partnership and respect, who'd proven that the world's judgment was not the final word on anyone's value. The transformation hadn't been in her body. She looked essentially the same as she had that day in Henderson's general store when the laughter had nearly broken her. She was still plus-sized, still built in a way society said women shouldn't be. But everything else had changed. Her understanding of herself, her confidence in her abilities, her willingness to take up space without apology, her certainty that she deserved love and respect and happiness. Grant had helped catalyze that transformation, but he hadn't created it. The strength had always been there, buried under years of cruelty. He'd simply helped her excavate it, believed in it when she couldn't believe in herself, reflected back to her what had always been true. 10 years after that humiliating day in the general store, Elena Cross Mercer stood as one of the most respected business owners in the Wyoming Territory. Her orchard employed dozens of workers year-round, produced fruit that sold throughout the region, and served as a model for sustainable cultivation practices. She'd been invited to speak at agricultural conferences, had written articles for farming journals, had become someone other cultivators sought out for advice and mentorship. But more importantly, she'd become someone who knew, truly, deeply knew, that her worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions, that she could be large in body and spirit both, that taking up space wasn't something to apologize for, that she deserved every good thing life offered her. The town that had mocked her now sought her approval. The society ladies who'd whispered cruel judgments now vied for invitations to her home. The merchants who'd barely tolerated her presence now competed for her business. It was a complete reversal, satisfying in its way, but also revealing about how shallow their judgment had always been. If Elena had lost weight, if she'd changed her body to fit their standards, they would have claimed her transformation as proof they'd been right all along, that she needed to change, that she'd been wrong to exist as she was. But she hadn't changed her appearance. She'd simply stopped accepting their narrative about what that appearance meant. And that refusal to internalize their poison, that insistence on defining her own worth, was what had actually transformed everything. On a warm summer evening, 15 years after her wedding, Elena hosted a garden party at the orchard. Lanterns hung from the trees, tables groaned with food, and music drifted across the grounds. Grace, now 18 and preparing to attend university to study agricultural science, moved among the guests with easy confidence, her mother's daughter in every way that mattered. Elena stood on the porch watching the celebration, Grant's arm around her waist, and marveled at the life they'd built. Their family had grown, 2 more children, both boys, were roughhousing near the barn under Carlos's watchful eye. The business had expanded beyond anything her father could have imagined. Their home was filled with love and laughter and the messy, beautiful chaos of family life. "What are you thinking about?" Grant asked, the same question he'd asked hundreds of times over their years together. "I'm thinking about that girl who walked into Henderson's general store convinced she was worthless," Elena said. "About how far she's come, how much she's learned." "She was never worthless," Grant said firmly. "She just needed to see herself clearly." "I needed someone to see me clearly first," Elena corrected. "Needed you to show me it was possible." "And now?" "Now I see myself," Elena said. "Not through your eyes or anyone else's, through my own. And Grant, what I see is someone I'm proud to be. Someone strong and capable and worthy. Someone who built something meaningful. Someone who deserves every happiness she's found." Grant kissed her temple. "I've always seen that woman. I'm just glad you finally see her too." They stood together as the party continued around them, as their children played and their guests mingled and the orchard they'd built together rustled in the evening breeze. And Elena thought about the journey that had brought her here, from humiliation to hope, from invisibility to influence, from self-loathing to self-love. The moment everything had changed wasn't when Grant defended her in the general store, though that had been important. It wasn't even when he declared his love at the social, though that had been transformative. The moment everything changed was quieter, more internal, more profound. It was the moment Elena chose to see herself the way Grant saw her, clearly, completely, without the distortion of other people's cruelty. It was the moment she understood that worth isn't granted by external validation, but recognized through internal truth. It was the moment she stopped waiting for the world to accept her and simply accepted herself. That was the real transformation. That was the real victory. Not changing her body, not winning approval, not even finding love, though all of those things had happened in their own way. The victory was in choosing to believe she was worthy before anyone else confirmed it, in deciding that her value was inherent rather than earned, in understanding that she had always been enough exactly as she was. As the stars emerged overhead and the lanterns glowed warm against the darkness, Elena Cross Mercer looked out at the empire she'd built. Not just the thriving orchard and successful business, but the family she'd created, the community she'd shaped, the legacy she was leaving for her children. She thought about her father, buried on the hillside overlooking all of this, and hoped he could see what his faith in her had helped create. She thought about the town that had tormented her and how their cruelty had ultimately failed to break her. She thought about Grant, whose love had been the mirror that helped her see her own worth. But mostly, she thought about herself. About the journey from shame to pride, from hiding to standing tall, from accepting other people's judgment to trusting her own. The woman the world had decided wasn't worth seeing had become impossible to ignore, not because she'd changed to fit their standards, but because she'd refused to accept their standards as relevant to her worth. That refusal, that courage, that hard-won understanding, that was her greatest achievement. Not the orchard, not the business, not even the family she cherished. Her greatest achievement was learning to see herself clearly and choosing to love what she saw. And in the end, that was the only transformation that had ever really mattered.